Hi everyone. Actually, most of you already know me, but my name is Lenora Henson, and I am the Deputy Director Curator here at the Theodore Roosevelt Inaugural Site. On behalf of our Board of Trustees and staff, I'd like to welcome you to Speaker Night. I'd especially like to welcome Dr. Christopher Faricy, who is our guest speaker this evening, and whose talk is titled Me and the IRS, What Americans Think About Tax Breaks and How It Influences Public Policy and Inequality. Speaker Night is our opportunity on the fourth Tuesdays of most months to invite experts to come in and help us think about some of the issues that were important during TR's presidency and continue to be relevant today. Taxes, public policy, and inequality certainly fit that particular bill. The TR Site Speaker Night series is made possible by the generous support of M&T Bank, as well as the New York State Council on the Arts, or NYSCA. Our sincere thanks to both of those groups. I should also mention that NYSCA's support has enabled us to record all of our speakers, not only this year, but also last year. So if you've missed any of them, I hope you'll check out the recordings on our YouTube channel. As I already mentioned, we are joined this evening by Dr. Christopher Faricy. He is an associate professor of political science at the Maxwell School of Citizenship and Public Affairs at Syracuse University. He's also the author of the 2015 book, Welfare for the Wealthy, Parties, Social Spending, and Inequality in the United States. His research has won a number of national awards, including the American Political Science Association's 2012 Harold D. Lasswell Award and the Midwestern Political Science Association's 2010 Pi Sigma Alpha Award. His research has been written about in the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Huffington Post, Vox, CNN, the American Prospect, and Mother Jones. Chris received a PhD in political science from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill and an MA from the University of Michigan. His talk today is based on a forthcoming book from the Russell Sage Foundation entitled The Other Side of the Coin, Public Attitudes Toward Government Spending in America. Having said that, I'm delighted to turn the podium over to Chris. Please join me in welcoming him.
Thank you so much for coming out this evening. Beautiful summer night, and you come to a talk on tax policy. So you must have a thirst for knowledge, and I hope to be able to fulfill that this evening. And I want to thank especially Lenora for inviting me out and being able to visit the beautiful city of Buffalo and learn about the presidential history, which I was ignorant about before being invited. And it's been fun to go through the house and learn about this piece of history right here in Western New York. So tonight I'm going to talk about public opinion towards tax breaks in the United States. And you might be thinking, well, this could be a very short talk, right? Tax breaks. People like tax breaks, right? Why do people like tax breaks? People hate taxes. All right, we're done, right? Thank you very much. Like, we have some drinks. But it's actually a little bit more complicated than that. And here are a couple ideas to think about that might counter the idea about why tax breaks are popular. Tax breaks, the majority of them benefit the rich and oftentimes large corporations. When we ask people on survey polls about their feelings towards various groups in American society, the rich and large corporations don't rate very well. And when we ask people especially about which group should receive government funding or government assistance, people definitely don't think the rich should get money, and they definitely don't think large corporations should get money. Right? So one thing to grapple with is, why are tax breaks presumably popular if they do benefit groups that the American public believes should not receive government assistance? And another thing to consider is that the government itself is not very popular with the American people. And tax breaks are, in a sense, subsidies that one group gets and another group doesn't. Right? Homeowners get assistance through tax breaks, renters don't. People who get their health care and pensions through employment, where the boss voluntarily offers it, gets tax subsidies. But people who are not in those positions don't receive those benefits. So we hear complaints about the government picking winners and losers and having their thumb on the scale, and that's exactly what tax subsidies are. And you know who would really hate tax breaks? Teddy Roosevelt. Teddy Roosevelt argued for progressive taxation, and most tax breaks actually erode the progressivity of the federal tax system. So my co-author and I have to say that this book is co-authored with a friend of mine from graduate school who was at Bucknell University, Christopher Ellis. So we jointly claim the findings and all the mistakes in the book too. So I want to give credit to him as well. So this book that should be out late December or early in the winter of 2020 examines how popular are tax breaks really, why are they popular, with whom, and what does that actually mean for public policy, what the government does. So let me first show you some what we call baseline results. These results are from a national survey. We received a grant from the Russell Sage Foundation in New York City, and the grant allowed us to conduct 7 nationally representative surveys. And we hired a firm out of California to conduct these. And in one of our surveys, we asked people about their support or opposition to 7 of the largest tax breaks that are in the US tax code. So from left to right, we asked people about the tax exclusion for employment-based health insurance, the charitable contribution deduction, the home mortgage interest deduction, the earned income tax credit, tax deductions for things like 401ks and IRAs, deducting for the 529 plans, and finally, deductions for student loans. And these are some of the largest tax breaks for individuals that are in the tax code. So just to kind of give you a little idea, there are over 90 tax breaks in the US tax code for individuals. And I'll show you a slide in this in a little bit. The government loses over $1 trillion a year on all the tax breaks that are in the tax code. And most tax breaks go towards individuals and households and not corporations. So these programs you hear, this program right here is the largest tax break there is in the tax code. The employment-based healthcare insurance tax exclusion costs the government over $300 billion a year. Just this one program. So these are not small programs. The government actually spends a lot of money, loses a lot of money that they otherwise would have without these programs on the books. So for each of these programs, the dark bars are the amount of people in our survey that supported them. The light blue bars are people who did not register an opinion. And then the grayish bars are people who oppose these programs. And what you can see is that, yeah, tax breaks are pretty popular. Now, some things I'd point out, they're not wildly popular. The most popular one, which is also the most expensive one, registers 70% support. But most of these are somewhere between 50 and 60%. And to give you some context, when we ask people about support for Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, that's where those programs register too. So they're not any more popular than some of the traditional spending programs you think of when you think of the federal government. So popular, yes. Wildly popular, untouchable, doesn't seem so, especially outside of the healthcare insurance plan. Another thing that struck us too, which you don't see when you ask people about Social Security and Medicare and Medicaid, is that this middle bar is pretty high for programs that I'm sure a lot of people in this room, and you might assume a lot of your fellow citizens know well. Things like the home mortgage interest deduction, you're looking at it, 1 out of 4 people had no opinion about the home mortgage interest deduction. Charitable contribution, around the same. About 1 out of 4 people hadn't thought about it well enough to form an opinion, whether they support or oppose. And normally, when you see those on surveys, that's an indication that people are punting on this question. They just don't know enough about this program. It may be a program that they've never heard about until they've been asked this on a survey, so they choose this one that they neither support nor oppose. When we ask about Social Security, Medicare, everyone has an opinion. People either support it or they oppose it. You don't get a lot of people who don't offer an opinion on those large programs. So that indicates to us that these programs are not as well known as some of the larger traditional social programs in the United States. So that also makes me question the support bars, because if a lot of people don't know about these programs, then some people may support them, but if you give them additional information about the program, for example, the 401ks and IRA programs help households mainly making over $200,000. We found in questions, if you give people just that little bit of information, program support erodes for these. So the takeaway is, yes, these are popular. A majority of the public supports these, but we think that support for these programs is a little soft. Now, are they more popular than regular spending programs, the government providing a direct service or direct benefit to people? Well, we designed a series of experiments in our surveys to try to get at this. And here's the way that we tried to answer this question. So there were 1,000 respondents on each of our surveys. And what we did is that we took 7 programs. Some of them are actual programs, some of them are new proposals that aren't actual programs, like the green energy tax credits. And we gave half of our sample randomly one question and gave the other half of our sample, the other 500 people, a slightly different question. The only thing that changed between Group A and Group B was whether we described the program as a direct program from the government or whether we described it as a tax credit. Right? So the purpose of us doing this, what we call a survey experiment, is that all the other words in the question are exactly the same. We gave information on the cost of the program, it's exactly the same. The only thing different is the wording, whether we describe the program as a tax break or direct program. And then we ask people to indicate their support. And what you see is that when you compare apples to apples, when you have the same program and you only change how it's delivered, I highlighted the support down here. You can see across the board for various types of program, green energy credits, paying for health care, student loans, people show more support for something presented as a tax subsidy or a tax break than they do a direct program. Right? So there's something about tax breaks that resonates with the American public, and they are more popular than delivering services through a check or through a direct service. So our book tries to examine why that is. So I'm going to talk today about why tax breaks are popular with the American voter. I'm going to discuss how these attitudes influence what the government actually does and income inequality in this country. And then finally, because how can you not, there's a lot of interest, I'm going to discuss generally public opinion in the 2020 presidential election, and mainly kind of give a synopsis of what political science would tell us about what to expect over the next year. Because a year from now, we're probably past the party's national conventions and going into the heart of presidential campaign season. So one of our first explanations about why tax breaks are popular goes to the kind of nature of what is commonly called the American public opinion paradox. So one question that people often have, if you look at the country as a whole, if you try to describe the American voter, the American electorate, would you describe it as liberal or conservative? Well, the answer to that question is it depends. And it depends in part about how you measure and conceptualize ideology. And the confusing part about American public opinion is that if you describe and conceptualize ideology one way, the American public looks liberal. If you describe ideology a different and equally valid way, it looks conservative. And I'll explain to you what those are and why that matters for tax break support. So one way to analyze ideology is to simply ask people questions about things the government does. And ask them if they want the government to do more of that, keep it the same, or do less. And the way that political scientists code these answers, if people ask for more government activity, more government spending, that gets coded as a liberal response. If people want less government activity and less government funding, that gets coded as a conservative response. So here's an example of a national survey asking people what they want the government to do in a whole bunch of areas. And the choices in this survey were, is the government doing too little, which if people indicate that is considered a liberal response, or too much, which is the conservative response, and then there's a middle response of they're doing just about right. And you can see for a whole host of issues, you have a majority of the public saying the government is doing too little in this area. Protecting the environment, protecting the nation's health, dealing with drug addiction, assistance to the poor, Social Security, child care, all these have majorities of Americans saying they want more government activity. Government's not doing it. So when you ask people about specific policies and specific programs, the nation consistently, since 1950 we have this finding, comes across as liberal, as they want the government to do more. But that's just one way to conceptualize ideology. Another way is to simply ask people to categorize themselves. Say, okay, what are you? Would you describe yourself as a conservative, or as a moderate, or as a liberal? And when you ask people to conceptualize themselves, to put themselves in a box, a plurality of people identify as conservative. So this is the public opinion paradox. These are the same people, right? So this comes across on the same surveys again and again. If you ask people specific questions, they will call for more money and more government activity. But if you ask people to identify themselves, most of the country will say that they are moderate or conservative. Now, how do we reconcile this? Well, one explanation we have is that Americans are operationally liberal and symbolically conservative. Meaning that if you ask people specifically about detailed policies, people often want the government's assistance. But people like the symbolism of smaller government, limited government, lean government, a government that reflects Judeo-Christian values. So people like the symbolism of small and lean and limited government. But again, it results in this paradox where, and this is why it might be confusing to voters, is Republicans and Democrats can both claim at any time in the last 50 years to speak for the country and in a way they be right. Democrats can say, look at policy questions, look at when we ask people what they want, and they will say, people want more government activity. And Republicans can say, this is a moderate to conservative country, and we're going to govern it. Now, what we think that means as far as support for tax breaks is that tax subsidies, especially for things that Americans care about, health care, retirement plans, paying for their kids' college, right? Problems that people identify. Tax breaks serve the American sweet spot in that they are a government financing of something, a problem that people have identified that they want help with. But it's government financing in a conservative way, right? It's a tax subsidy. So it doesn't have the heavy hand of government as part of the program's subscription, right? It is a subsidy for oftentimes individuals or the private sector. So the fact that tax breaks sit at this intersection of where the American public is, we believe lends to some of its support. Another reason in modern politics about why tax breaks might be popular is that we have, and you know this from reading the newspaper or watching cable news, we are in highly polarized times. And partisan voters oftentimes will pick stances on policies to match their partisanship, right? Which is opposite of the textbook way that we think voters should act, right? Theoretically, how the founders and how Roosevelt probably thought voters should come to a partisan identification is that they should think long and hard about what role they want government to play in society, what stances they should take on specific policies that they care about, and then once they've decided those policy issues, choose a party that more closely adheres to those positions. What we found is that that is the opposite of how the American voter works. Americans, and not just Americans, but just citizens across countries, feel psychologically a need to have group associations. And people form attachments, psychological and social attachments to parties in their 20s and 30s, and then they end up adopting the policy positions of that party over time. Right? So, why that matters for this is that if you ask people about welfare, what happens for most people who are partisans is they think, okay, welfare, is that a Democratic program or a Republican program? And if they categorize it as a Democratic program, which most folks do, then the next thought is, I'm a Democrat, I'm for it, I'm a Republican, I hate it. Right? Like that's the cognitive flow. The tricky part about tax breaks is that it presents to people ideologically conflicting information. So for programs that finance college, most people, if you ask them, would say financing college, the government financing college is a liberal democratic thing. But it's a tax break. Most people would say tax breaks are Republican things. So when you ask people about programs that are tax deductions for financing college, they can't fit it in a partisan box. They can't put it as a Democratic program or a Republican program, so they have to kind of evaluate the program on its merits. And people generally like supporting popular goals like paying college. So the fact that it can't be dismissed by one whole group of the American electorate is another reason why tax breaks, especially for social welfare policies, are popular, is that it doesn't fit in neatly to a Democratic or Republican box. You know, one thing that surprised us is that we asked people which party supported various tax breaks more forcefully. And one program we asked about was the Earned Income Tax Credit. Now, the Earned Income Tax Credit came out of the Heritage Foundation. It was passed by Ford and has been expanded by Republican and Democratic presidents for decades. There is no program I can think of that has enjoyed more bipartisan support than the Earned Income Tax Credit. You ask voters which party, and the choices were Democratic, Republican, or both, or neither, so they had 4 choices. Most voters, because it goes towards low-income households, think that it's a Democratic program, or that the Democratic Party supports this more than the Republican Party. In fact, the Republican Party has promoted this as kind of an alternative to welfare. So this goes to another kind of fact generally in political science. Voters don't have a lot of policy information or knowledge. So they're really looking hard for partisan cues from people on partisan media or party elites that are covered through the media. And if they don't have those partisan cues, they have a difficult time coming to preferences on policies. So let me give you an idea about how this matters and what this looks like. So this is two charts that represent data from our national surveys. And again, we asked about 7 programs, but I just showed here data on the mortgage interest in the retirement savings. And here's how to read these charts. So on the left-hand side, the vertical axis, these numbers indicate lower or higher support for these programs. So numbers that are closer to 1 and 1.5, that's people who are not strongly supportive of these programs. Higher up on the scale is more support. And then on the horizontal axis, we have the mean value, the average score across our survey with direct spending and tax expenditure. And we did the same thing as I described previously, where for our 1,000 respondents in our 7 national surveys, 500 people got a question about home mortgage interest presented as a direct program, and 500 people got it as a tax expenditure. And these groups are nearly identical in characteristics. Right? So it allows us to isolate the effect of presenting something as a direct program versus a tax break. And here's what you can see. So let's look at the 2 groups. We have liberals and conservatives. We broke these groups apart. So when you present the home mortgage interest program as a program where the government writes you a check to help you with your home mortgage interest, liberals support it more than conservatives, right? Not much of a surprise. But what's to us fascinating is that if you present it like it is as a deduction, it reverses which group supports it more. Conservatives support the home mortgage interest deduction more than liberals do. Right, so you can actually reverse the order of which group supports a type of government financing by either having the program as a direct check or as a tax break, in this case for the home mortgage interest. And you can see, again, the same kind of trend here. And something to notice is that one of our conclusions is that liberals are not very picky about how the government delivers money. Right? Liberals are, in a sense, focusing on the government financing some goal, retirement security, home mortgage, paying for college. There isn't much, in fact, these statistically are indistinguishable differences on the liberal part. So liberals don't have any preference for whether something's a tax credit or direct check. But for conservatives, you can see a huge difference, right? Look at the change in direct spending. I mean, you're going from opposing something to supporting something. From opposing something to somewhat supporting something. So that's what this line means as far as the different points. I mean, literally, you're able to flip conservatives from not supporting a program to supporting a program by making it a tax credit. Right? So one reason that tax credits, and this is important, is that it is a way to get some groups who would otherwise be antagonistic towards government spending to actually support a government program by presenting it as a tax credit. And we have similar results for another group, which is we ask people about their trust in government. So again, this is the mortgage interest in retirement savings. Again, on the vertical axis, higher is more support, lower is less support. And then we have direct spending and the tax break. So again, for people who have high levels of trust in the government, and by the way, there are very few of these people in the survey, so you're talking about fewer than 100 people out of 1,000. It doesn't matter whether something's a direct check or a tax break. But for people who have low trust in government, which is the majority of Americans, whether something is a direct check or a tax break makes a difference in their level of support. right? And we found this also for Republicans versus Democrats. We found this also for people who think the government is inefficient and wasteful versus people who don't think the government is inefficient and wasteful, right? So for a whole bunch of important characteristics and groups in American politics, you can actually change support for government policy by switching the mode of how you pay for it from a direct service or check to a tax credit. Now, another reason why tax breaks are popular. One fun thing about doing research and doing this type of book is that you get to read other people's research. And in writing this book, I read a whole bunch of research on public opinion in Europe. And one thing that was interesting for me and startling for me to find out is that citizens seemingly all over the world support government spending only on groups that they find deserving. So there seems to be something universal about the fact that humans tend to make this designation when they're deciding to support a government program or government financing. They want to know who's getting the money, and once they know who's getting the money, they think, is that group deserving of government assistance? So to give you an example, one of my favorite papers that I found in researching this book, there's a public opinion poll done of Sweden, which, you know, big welfare state, one of the Nordic countries, high taxes, high welfare spending, and also the United States, lower taxes, smaller welfare state. What the researcher found in doing public opinion polls in both of these countries is that both Swedes and Americans use deservingness as a guide to whether they support programs. The difference between Swedes and Americans are Swedes found many more people deserving than Americans did. Right? So the difference between Americans and citizens in the Nordic countries, where there are big welfare states, isn't in how they go about deciding supporting a program, it's who they think is deserving of government benefits and who's not. And you know, what has been found, and this is important for what's going on today in politics, if you are in a country that is more racially and ethnically homogeneous, more uniform, it's much easier to support government spending. Because when people ask you about, do you support something, you bring up a picture in your mind. And the picture you bring up in your mind is someone who looks like you. Right? If you're asked this question in Norway or Sweden, if you're asked this question in a multi-ethnic democracy, like the United States, sometimes the picture you bring up is someone who looks like you, sometimes it's someone who doesn't look like you. And if you bring up a picture of someone who doesn't look like you, chances are you're not going to support the program. So one thing that we found is that people don't have information about policy. People don't spend a lot of their time, they're busy, they have lives, they have children, they have grandkids, they have vacations, they have jobs, thinking about policy. So given that most people don't have a lot of information about policy, when you ask these questions, a lot of people are just using the words in the question to make an evaluation of the program. Right? They haven't spent a long time thinking or evaluating the program. So if you ask people about a tax credit, it gives people two pieces of information just in the program name alone. The person who gets the money works, and the person who gets the money pays taxes. And those are two criteria that people determine to consider whether a group is deserving or not. Right? So this is especially important when it comes to programs for the poor, like welfare or food stamps or things like the earned income tax credit, is that when people give money to the poor, again, in the United States and in other countries, they group the poor, most people, not all, into deserving poor and undeserving poor. And if they think a program helps a substantial amount of what they conjure up in their mind as undeserving poor, they're not going to support it. Tax breaks and tax credits designed at working class, low income people do the work for people. It does the cognitive work for people by saying, these people are deserving. These people are working, these people are paying taxes, so therefore they deserve government money. One thing we asked is, we listed a bunch of groups and gave people choices of whether they think that group is very deserving, somewhat deserving, not at all deserving of government benefits. And we didn't say what type, just general government benefits. And you can see the groups that come across. So the two groups that a majority of the country think are deserving of benefits are the elderly and the poor. After that, you get just under 50% about those looking for work. And so I'm just talking about very deserving. You can see if you throw in somewhat deserving, if you throw in those two categories, everyone deserves money except for large corporations, right? If you put the two bars together. But I'm just talking about the black bar. Small businesses. So what's interesting in terms of tax credit is that, look at these groups here, kind of in the middle, near the bottom. Look at homeowners. The home mortgage interest deduction and the property tax deduction are two of the largest tax breaks there are. And politicians think that those two tax breaks are untouchable, that you can't get rid of them. Even though economists who study these two tax breaks have found they make no difference in people buying a home. The difference that has been found is that people will buy a larger home because of the home mortgage interest deduction, but it doesn't take someone from renting to buy. And not a lot of people think homeowners deserve government benefits. Homeowners get a bunch of government benefits, especially when you think about the next to nothing that renters get. And then finally, people on welfare and large corporations. What I think is funny, if you go back to the slide on individual preferences for programs, look at the difference, and again, these are the same people, of people on welfare and the poor, as far as considered to be deserving. Who are the people on welfare? Chances are they're poor, right? But people had differing views about how deserving those two groups are. So one thing that, and the reason why we asked this question is that we had to eliminate the possibility that the reason that tax breaks were popular, and that the reason where tax breaks were more popular than direct spending, is who was getting the money. And I think these results can eliminate that. The middle class, people with kids in college, homeowners, these are some of the big tax breaks that there are. And those groups are considered to be that deserving by the American public. So the reason why people support tax breaks has to do with something besides what groups get the money. And we also asked people, and people actually did a pretty good job of this, which economic group that they thought received the majority of benefits for different programs. And we asked about Medicare and Medicaid and under public health, Social Security, the home mortgage interest deduction, and 401ks. And what you can see here is that people understand that the rich and the middle class are the primary benefits of tax subsidies, and the middle class and the poor are more beneficial of public programs like Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security. And what's interesting is that there is a partisan divide when it comes to tax breaks. When you break apart these results by Democrat and Republican voter, most Republican voters say the primary economic beneficiaries of tax breaks are the middle class. And when you look at Democrats say the primary beneficiary of tax breaks are the rich. Right? So that also could inform, given people's perceptions of the middle class versus the rich, why Republicans tend to support tax breaks more than Democrats. Here's another experiment we did to try to get at this idea that we have that tax breaks in and of themselves bestow deservingness on a group. here's what we did. We gave people little vignettes on our national survey. We told them little stories. So in this story here, it was about a program that helps people pay for necessities. It was a single father with 2 kids in our vignette. So we said, okay, here's a single father with 2 kids. He's looking for work, and he's just qualified for a government program that helps him pay for necessities like groceries and electricity. Now, half the group got this vignette and the program was described as a tax break, and half the group got it described as a direct spending program. And then, after that, we asked them, okay, on a 5-point scale from very deserving to very undeserving, how deserving of government benefits is this person? And again, the 2 groups were given the same story. People who were given the tax break story found the single dad with 2 kids as more deserving than the same single dad with 2 kids who got a check delivered in the mail from the government. Right? So again, so this offers, we think, evidence that the tax break in and of itself signals to voters that someone is deserving of government benefits. Now, here's where we think this is critically important as far as government's efforts to help the poor in 2019. So if you look at people at or below the poverty line, about a third are white, a third are black, and a third are Hispanic. Right? So and if you take that number versus those groups in the population, blacks and Latinos are overrepresented among the poor, and whites are underrepresented, right? But if you look at the poor as a category, it's a third, a third, a third. Now, one thing that previous work has shown, and the best work on this is by a guy who is at UCLA now, named Marty Gillens, and it's a book called Why Americans Hate Welfare. And in this book, he finds that one reason why some white Americans downgrade welfare as a program is that they think that the majority beneficiaries are black and Latino, and they think that blacks and Latinos don't have as strong a work ethic as whites do. So they make that connection and downgrade welfare, food stamps, but are supportive of things like job training. And this has been replicated by other scholars, and similar findings have been found. So we know that programs like welfare and food stamps are what we call racialized, meaning that when people think about welfare and food stamps, they think they oftentimes conjure up a black or Latino recipient in ways that they don't think in the same way when asked about Social Security and Medicare. Right? And the fact that some white voters conjure up black and Latino recipients when asked about welfare affects their support, especially with some white voters who have racial animus. So we wanted to see if you described a program like welfare and food stamps and described it as a tax credit, would it change how people who have racial animus evaluate the program? And here are the results. So first, let me kind of explain the horizontal axis. In political science and in social science, we have a series of 4 questions that get at people's racial attitudes. Now, asking about racism in 2019 is tricky, right? When you look at questions done by political scientists in the 1950s that asked about racism, the questions were, do you believe that blacks are genetically inferior? Right? That is the type of question asked in the 1950s about racism, right? No one is going to say yes to that question in 2019. No one, right? Even if someone believes it, it's just socially unacceptable to provide that answer. So there are a series of 4 questions that try to get at what we call symbolic racism. Okay? And I'll give you an example of one of the questions. So one of the questions is, Italians, Irish, and Jews work their way up in America through hard work, blacks should do the same. And then you give people a 5-point scale about how strongly they agree or disagree. So people who agree strongly with that claim, along with 3 other questions, are considered to have some racial animus. So that is what is being represented here on the horizontal. Like high numbers are people who are symbolically racist. Low numbers are low levels of symbolic racism. And then on the vertical axis, our support for program that we described in terms of welfare, but we did not use the term welfare because of the problem of welfare being a racialized, loaded term. So we described the program without using the term. And here's what we found. You see the lines cross, right? So if you look at people at the low end of the symbolic racism scale, they prefer welfare delivered directly over a tax credit. If you look at people at the high end of the symbolic racism scale, they prefer welfare delivered through a tax credit versus direct services and check. So again, our conclusion is that for programs that have been racialized, you can actually increase support among people who think in terms of race when it comes to policies by presenting something as a tax credit, because then even if they think of a black or Latino, then the next stereotype of that person not having a good work ethic is countered by the fact that the person is a worker and a taxpayer. Now, another way that we got at this was asking people, again, we had the 4 questions that get at symbolic racism, and asking people their support, and we described and used the term earned income tax credit, and we described and used the term welfare. And what you see is that across the board, the earned income tax credit is more popular than welfare. So whether low symbolic racism or high symbolic racism, people prefer the EITC. But again, what's interesting is notice the slope of the lines. The slope of the lines is where the action is here. There is only a little bit of a slope to this top line, which means that there is some difference between support for low and high racism for the EITC, but not much. But for welfare, there's a substantial difference. Support gets cut in half, right? So if you go from lowest racism scores to highest racism scores, support for welfare actually gets chopped in half. So again, we take this as evidence that, and the practical implication is that if the government wants to help the working poor in a way that is politically sustainable, regardless of which party's in power, tax credits might be a better way to go. Right? Thinking about taking programs like food stamps and welfare and transitioning them into tax credits is a way to cut out the legs of political opposition to providing benefits to poor people. Now, what does all of this matter? The government provides goods and services in two main different ways. Right, so you think about healthcare. So we have Medicare, we have Medicaid, we have Veterans Health, right? All government directed, run programs. But as I mentioned, the largest tax break is for employment-sponsored healthcare insurance. And there's also healthcare savings accounts, another big program. So the government actually is financing healthcare directly and indirectly at the same time. And this is true for homes and renting. It's true for retirement. There's Social Security, but there's tax breaks for 401ks and IRAs. Now, why we think showing that these programs are popular matters is that spending through the tax code has increased. So economists and budget experts call tax breaks tax expenditures. Now, it might seem ridiculous to us as average citizens to call tax break an expenditure, but because a tax break means we're paying fewer taxes and we get help for healthcare and retirement. But if you're a budget expert for the government and you're doing the government's books, it doesn't matter to you whether the government loses $300 million by sending a check to people or loses $300 million by saying these people who do this can pay less in their taxes. If you're balancing the budget for the government, either way, the government's out $300 million. So, and because these breaks are specific and targeted uses of the government money, right? They're not, a tax cut is everyone gets lower income tax rates, right? That's different. Tax breaks are trying to get people to do something. They're trying to get you to own a home, or buy health care, or send your kids to college, or give money to charities, right? So the fact that these are purposeful redirections of money means that economists and budget experts qualify tax breaks as what they call tax expenditures. But the point I want to make is that it's a huge amount of money. This is from 2016, billions of dollars, and that's $1.6 trillion that the government lost in 1 year, one fiscal year, in all the tax breaks together. This is Social Security, this is non-defense discretionary, Medicare, defense, Medicaid down the line. And it's a huge amount of money that the government spends every year to get people to do things. And it has grown over time. So again, one of the points we make with the book is that one of the reasons why it has grown over time is politicians have learned there's less of a political cost to pay to promote these types of programs. And Democrats have learned this too, like Clinton loved it. So Larry Summers, who was one of Clinton's finance gurus, promoted these up and down when he was working for Clinton. Obama used these as a big part of Obamacare, right? So Democrats and Republicans have used this. And one thing to know is that it really affects what our country looks like and how we do things like healthcare and education. This is an international comparison of public versus private spending on areas of healthcare, education, welfare, and retirement. The dark bar is public spending as a percentage of gross domestic product, GDP, and the lighter bar is private spending, which is financed and subsidized by tax breaks on these same areas. So first, take a look at the bold bars, okay? The United States is pretty low, right? It's much lower than the UK, Denmark, Sweden, France, Germany, even Japan, which wasn't really until recently considered a welfare state. The United States, on public programs like Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, welfare, doesn't spend a lot in international comparison. But if you look at the private side, we're the world's leader. Private spending on healthcare, education, retirement is huge compared to a lot of our European allies, right? So the United States spends a lot on social welfare programs. The difference in the United States versus a lot of European countries is that we spend a lot publicly, but we spend a lot more privately compared to other nations. And one reason why we spend a lot privately is because of the tax subsidies. Think about the cost control problems in healthcare. Think about the cost controls in my industry, higher education. Cost is a huge problem for colleges. Cost is a huge problem for healthcare. Look at the tax code. Look at how many tax breaks there are for healthcare. And economists have proven that the number one tax break that economists hate is the number one largest tax break, the employment-sponsored exclusion for healthcare. Because it causes people to overuse healthcare insurance. If they had to actually pay the cost of the healthcare insurance, people would consume less healthcare. Economists hate it, and if you look at international comparisons of cost on healthcare in the United States compared to other countries, we dwarf other countries. And again, industries that have problems with cost control are the same industries where the government subsidizes people to buy stuff with tax subsidies. And we don't think we do not think that is a coincidence. So, as a practical result of what this means, the EITC has grown substantially more than welfare. So if you would go out on the street and pull someone aside and say, what is the biggest program for the poor? They'd probably say welfare. They'd be wrong. The government spends last year 3 times the amount on the earned income tax credit than they did on welfare. The acronym is TANF. 3 times the amount. EITC has far surpassed welfare as the government's largest direct effort to help the working people. But do you hear the EITC get attacked on cable news? Do you hear politicians on the stump attacking the EITC? No. And in large part, again, because it goes towards people who are working, but it is again, the United States' largest direct welfare program right now, and we think that its popularity compared to welfare is part of the reason why you see these changes. And the last thing I'll mention, because I talked about how the popularity of tax breaks is good news and bad news for the government's role in creating income inequality. So when we think about the rise of income inequality, which is being a big political problem, we might think of Amazon or Google or globalization or international trade, right? Technology, and those are all reasons for the rise of income inequality. But the government, the federal government, has played a role in making income inequality worse. Now, one way that the government helps income inequality is through things like the EITC, which again has bipartisan support. But for most tax breaks, the disproportionate amount of tax breaks accrue to the wealthiest people who are least vulnerable in society, right? Who least need government assistance. There are old stories. If you would walk on the floor of Congress and describe the home mortgage interest deduction as a direct program, that the government is going to send checks to people who live in mansions, or the government's going to send checks to people who earn $500,000 who get health insurance through their corporation, you'd be laughed off the floor of Congress. But that's what we do every single year with these tax subsidies. The way that the tax subsidies are designed, anything that is a deduction gives more money to wealthier people than poorer people. Because the value of the deduction relates to whatever your highest bracket is, whatever the highest bracket you cash out at in the federal tax code. So you could have, as an example, a low income person and a high income person both contribute $10,000 to charities. But the high income person is going to get much more money back in the charitable contribution deduction than the low income person, even though they donated the exact same amount. Right? And where you really get this skew in tax breaks helping the rich is in employment-based benefits. If you look at what types of employees are voluntarily offered and enroll in employment-type pensions and healthcare, and which employees aren't, there's a systematic difference. People who are in small mom and pop shops, people who are in the service economy, people who do part-time or seasonal work don't get offered these benefits and therefore don't have access to the government subsidies in the lieu of tax exclusions. Wealthier people in large corporations who are more educated are in jobs that get offered these benefits. And with these benefits come the federal tax breaks. So for a lot of these reasons, there's just a tremendous skew. This looks at the distribution of benefits from the very largest tax breaks in the tax code. This is from 2017. And it breaks the population down. This is the poorest quintile. This is the middle class. That's the wealthiest 20%. The wealthiest 20% get over half the benefits from the major tax breaks in the tax code. The middle class only gets 16, and the poorest folks get only 5%, right? The richest people in America get 10 times what the poorest do when it comes to benefits from tax breaks. So the government makes income inequality worse. And the popularity of these programs and politicians pivoting to these programs makes the government's role in income inequality worse. Right? So the last part, because you've been a great sport and gone through all the public opinion on tax break stuff, we can do something fun to talk about the election. And I can give you a little bit of what political science says about the role of public opinion and how it'll play in the 2020 election. So here's how I'll do this. I will give you reasons that research say Trump is going to win re-election and research to say that he might lose. Okay? So one thing we know is that incumbents in our modern era have a high probability of winning re-election. So Trump has an advantage of people probably in 2016 could not visualize him as president. Now they can. Now for a lot of people that's not great, but for some people that's been fine, and incumbency is a general advantage for someone running for election. If for nothing else, what you see going on in the past week is that Trump is trying to define the election before the Democrats choose a candidate, right? That Trump is trying to make the face of the Democratic Party the 4 freshman congresswomen and not whoever the eventual nominee is. So that's an advantage of incumbency, right? Like you're not running against anyone, so you can get a head start on campaigning. So that is one advantage. Another advantage is that there is a very tight historical trend between presidents getting reelected and the performance of the economy. Now, you might hear a lot about this in the media, but I want to give you a caveat based upon research. Performance of the economy matters for people's presidential vote, but only how the economy is doing 3 months out of the election. How the economy is doing right now doesn't matter. If the economy is going gangbusters 3 months out, that's good for Trump. If it tanks between now and August of 2020, that's really bad news. So the economy matters for people's evaluation of the sitting president, but only the economy right before people go and cast their vote. So if the economy is still performing as well as it is now, that's good for Trump's re-election prospects. Another caveat I'd add to that is that relationship, which has been decades proven, is getting weaker more recently. And it's getting weaker for interesting reasons. That people learn about the economy from the news, right? You see the stock markets going up and down, you see the employment numbers. In the past, that was representative of how you, yourself, and your family were doing. More and more, we found that national economic statistics are divorced from people's lived economic experiences. Stock market's going great, unemployment's low, people still feel stressed out. People still live in paycheck to paycheck. So national indicators used to be a quick piece of data we could pull to get a snapshot about how the average family was doing. And that's become less and less so. So again, economy, usually an historical predictor of whether someone gets reelected, but that's becoming weaker. Something that's not public opinion, well, it is public opinion related in a way, is that there are 3 states that in recent elections have been swing states that I say right now are trending pretty red. And that is Iowa and Ohio and Florida. So in the past, those were kind of considered to be purple and they could go one way or the other, but those are now are trending more Republican. It's harder to see Democrats winning on a national level in those states. Along those lines, states that seem right now, it's still early, but seem pivotal for 2020 are Wisconsin and Arizona. So Arizona, the Democrats did surprisingly well in 2016, and there's been an influx of people who've been priced out of California who have moved into Arizona and changed the demographics. Arizona and changed the demographics of Arizona. And Wisconsin, it could come down. Wisconsin could be the whole ballgame in 2020. And there were 3 Midwestern states that Trump won in 2016 that were part of the blue wall. right? Wisconsin, and Michigan and Pennsylvania. In Michigan and Pennsylvania, Trump's popularity has been under 50% for a long time. And Democrats won big victories in Michigan and Pennsylvania in 2016. So again, after 2016, people who make prognostications are fools, but I'm going to be foolish and say that Michigan and Pennsylvania are leading blue at this point. So those are reasons for Trump's potential reelection. Reasons that he may not be reelected is that there are aggregation sites that take all the questions that various firms ask about presidential approval and spit out a running total, a running average. And all of these aggregators of various polls approval, Trump has never been above 50%, which given the economy and given that he's an incumbent is really unusual. It's historically unprecedented in the modern polling age. And a number of polls have asked people about their vote intention for 2020, and a couple of those polls showed 50% of the respondents saying that they have no intention of voting for Trump. So being a year out from an election and an incumbent not being near 50%, and in some polls having half the respondents say they have no intention of voting for him is not a good sign for him. And then the other, I would say, trend working against him would be the 2016 election, or 2018 election. There was a lot of energy and a lot of mobilization in states that would be critical for 2020. So those are kind of some research anecdotes about what might happen.